Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Jordan Lasker. Hello, Jordan. How are you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm great. Jordan, tell us a little about yourself. Don't reveal your full professional identity. We would just like to know your research interests and what did you study as a student?
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm a PhD student. I'm currently a PhD student. I study test bias construction, and I make tools to accelerate measurement. And by that, I mean an area called additive conjoint measurement, which is a relatively computationally taxing measurement style where you attempt to assess if, for example, some measurement instrument you're working with is quantitative or
All
something like
right.
that.
So Jordan, you're the right person. On this show, we like to ask serious questions. What is an additive value, for example?
An additive value would just be something you could add to another thing. In the context of additive conjoint measurement, what it means is that you can treat the measurement as if it's like a ruler, for example. With a ruler, you can add an inch to an inch and you get 2 inches. But with, say, a personality questionnaire, you might add an answer to question one and an answer to question two and get more than or less than the number you were expecting based on their presented values. It is a quality of the instrument you're using that is not always tenable to assume. It's something that needs to be tested. Does that make sense? Do I need to say more?
Oh, no, you don't need to say more. We're not going to burden the audience. And I'm also going to ask you to define another term. This is the second to last term. What do we mean when we speak about linkage disequilibrium?
Linkage disequilibrium. You mean the non-random association of alleles at some
Yes,
point in
because
the
I've
genome?
read your studies, and if I plan to share them with other people, they may be interested in the concept because it is frequently used.
Right. So you have it's when you have a different like a sorry, my ear is itchy. A higher or lower than average frequency of some alleles at some locus that are associated with one another, and perhaps due to like some sort of population process like drift, or due to say assortative mating, or really whatever it could be. It just leads to an association of alleles that is different than what's expected under some sort of strict neutrality. Say,
Okay, and just be as simple as you can. You don't need to be too highfalutin. The issues are complicated, and we refuse to burden our guests. So simplicity is key on this show. So don't feel
understandable.
pressured to be too eloquent. And viewers like it when you're a quick speaker. But this is the last term that I will ask you to define. And the name may explain itself. Measurement invariance. What is that?
Oh, what a fun term! Measurement invariance is a state in which a measurement instrument provides the same interpretation in different groups. So if I give you and I give myself, and we say that we're in different groups, like I'm in the group of Ashkenazim and you're in the group of Americans in Texas or something like that. I don't really know. If we want to say that the test measures the same thing for both of us, and we can compare our scores on the test and the covariances of the items on the tests, we want to have measurement invariance. We want to be able to ensure that if we model the test in some fashion, the item parameters in the model are the same.
All right. Now we're going to discuss the big issue. So, Jordan, recently you published a paper on intelligence titled Global Ancestry and Cognitive Ability. But before we begin to discuss the article, we must talk about the origin of intelligence in Western society. So, Gerard Meisenberg and co-authors did a study titled Biogeographic Ancestry, Cognitive Ability, and Socioeconomic Outcomes. I'm not necessarily going to ask you to comment on the study because you're not listed as a writer, but the study made reference to various theories explaining the advent of intelligence in Western society. So, for example, the writer referred to Michael Woodley of Meany and his thesis re Holocene developments. Some attribute intelligence to Pleistocene advancements. Then there's the cold winter theory. There's the ice age theory. Jordan, do you subscribe to any of these notions? Because I don't believe we should really talk about intelligence in the West if we're not going to refer to some of these evolutionary concepts.
I don't really subscribe to any particular theory about the development of intelligence in the West or elsewhere. I believe development of intelligence is also the development of the same sort of construct in all areas of the world yet identified. So I don't believe it would be a question particular to the West or anywhere else. And if we are going to talk intelligence and its development, it seems as though, for example, East Asians seem to have developed to a higher degree than in the West, and it seems to be the same construct. So I'm not really no, I don't take any particular theories to explain why any group might be more or less intelligent than the other. And I don't particularly like theories like cold winters or whatnot because they're not amenable to testing. And I am a big fan of finding some way to test them. A lot of the way they're corroborated is mimicking the way Emery Lakatos, the
Yes.
epistemologist, would have understood theory testing, which is producing predictions and just assessing if those predictions hold true. And that's fine. And it's generally how a lot of work is, it's how a lot of work is done. I mean, quite clearly. But with this stuff, the predictions are rather vague and often they're a little tenuous, the evidence that is, with relationship to the theory. So no, I don't
Yes.
subscribe to any particular theory. I recognize that there should be a theory, but for me, what is more interesting is the differences between groups or whatever that exist, rather than the reasons they are here.
Okay, I'm quite interested in the reasons f- because if we're going to talk about intelligence, more than likely it has a root cause. If we're discussing racial differences in intelligence, or let's say population differences, because people find the word race offensive, so we say population differences in intelligence. Although when you refer to a population, you're still arguing that there are differences, but whatever. When if we're going to have this discussion, I think it should be grounded in some theory or narrative that's easy to understand. So, for example, on average, blacks have lower IQs on whites, and the finding is persistent. Why is it persistent? However, I do agree with you that some of these theories may appear implausible. Based on my own reading, there is a strong relationship between cold winters and delayed gratification. But the link between intelligence and cold winters is a bit more tenuous. It's not overly convincing.
I agree. Now, when it comes to cold winters specifically, um, one proposal that I've seen from economists is that it's farming that is explanatory of the relationship between, say, winter temperatures, and mind you, winter temperatures, not year-round temperatures,
Yes.
but seasonal variation in temperature. And planning ahead for seasonal variation is what explains why there are these differences in delayed gratification between different groups, because some groups have had to endure an evolutionary history, or you could just say a cultural history, in which they have had to deal with seasonality to a greater or lesser degree. Some groups closer to the equator might have to deal with it less, and some groups further away, but not too far away. Once you get too far, you approach simply being cold year round, which is very different. But some groups moderately far away seem to have had to endure that and might have had to, say, plan ahead more or gained an advantage from more planning ahead. I don't know to what extent that might apply to animals. We do find that there is a lot of, say, larger animal brains in the north a lot of the time. Not a perfect pattern. There's no such thing as such, but it's very often found. And the same thing is sort of found in a lot of human groups. It's not perfect again, but it is there to a
Yes.
degree.
But even what you just said is also debatable, the agricultural origins of time preference. One school
Yes.
asserts that society's delayed gratification because crops were unsuccessful. The agricultural season was unproductive. And because of
Mhm.
those difficulties, they were forced to improve productivity. Another school notes that agriculture was quite productive, hence, they were motivated to work longer hours.
Yeah, I think there's a large difference between these. With the former, where they're basically buffered by the elements and the relationship is due to their survival or differential rates of survival, that seems much more plausible to me. A lot of the my golly, the historical selection for hired intelligence was, I believe, likely due to just differential rates of survival. So, more intelligent mother is able to better care for her kids, or more intelligent man is able to get a better job and provide a warmer home for his family, et cetera, et cetera. And these, it seems plausible that people who are more intelligent will be more likely to plan ahead and plan ahead well enough to survive through circumstances in which situations are rough.
Yes, and
But
that
I don't really know.
you may okay. So I'll continue. And another objection to the cold winters theory is that some contend that the Eskimos live in very cold climates, but they're not overly intelligent. And Edward M. Miller, in a paper published around 2 years ago for Mankind Quarterly, he delved into the issue. I won't get into it on the show, but he argues that due to the size of the population, the growth of genes for intelligence was limited. But I'm yet to find a response that is very plausible. So the
Well,
yes, winters is that theory is yet to tell us why some groups, despite the harshness of their climate, are still not as intelligent as other groups.
so I want to be clear here. I'm not an advocate of cold winters theory, but the idea that the Eskimo, or however you would like to call their population, Inuit, whatever, are an exception is not actually accurate. As I've said, it's only applies to groups in which there are winters. When it's just cold year round or hot year round, this doesn't bleed to the seasonality that is supposed to impact time preference or intelligence or whatever it may be that is being impacted. The Eskimo thing is simply a misconception.
Yes, I get
It's
your
a
point.
misunderstanding.
But yeah, I'm happy that you're so bold, because usually when I'm reading critiques of the cold winter theory, they often point to the Eskimos. Yeah, but it's quite plausible. Cold winters predict delayed gratification of time. Therefore, if you're cold all the time, there's not a need for intense delayed gratification, because they're already accustomed to planning that cycle. So it becomes
Right.
obvious.
Yeah, if you get into a niche that is relatively constant year round, like the Eskimo have or any other far north population, all you have to worry about for the most part is simply exploiting that niche and making sure you don't overexploit the niche or become subject to some sort of epochal force like the end of our current ice age.
Yes. And another point again is that intelligence is contextual.
Mhm.
Even environments that are not cold do select for cognitive abilities,
Sure thing, especially with social relations, I believe. Although I
especially with what?
social relations, for
Okay.
example, interpersonal relationships among humans. There's there are various theories of how apes became intelligent, how hominins became an intelligent branch of, or a sapient branch of animal kind. And a lot of them seem to focus on the social element, competing with one another or cooperating with one another in larger competitions or display or something else of that nature that provides the context, regardless of other features of the environment or perhaps influenced by them, for whatever change might come about or be elicited. So, for example, you have people in near the equator. They might have organized into hunting bands, and these hunting bands might become matriarchal, and a matriarchal hunting band might have long distance matrilocal marriages, which leads to men associating in different ways than they would with patrilocality. And this could lead to longer distance wars, and longer distance wars could mean having to take account of larger networks of people, and this might benefit people who are more intelligent or whatever. There are lots and lots of ways for social interaction to give rise to selection for intelligence, although I believe, again, quite speculative.
Yeah, it's just like a study that was done some years ago by Bugles, positing that Europeans, due to environmental issues, develop long-lasting relationships to promote or eventually financial markets. So because the markets were so volatile, people had to cooperate with each other. And that in the
Mhm.
long term would select for openness to experiences and intellect. And these factors combined would have a positive impact on intelligence.
Yeah, that's very similar to the sort of anthropology you get in Marvin Harris's Cannibals and Kings, where it's a realistic way of looking at how environments might lead to changes in social relations, like the hydraulic hypothesis that
Yes.
areas like northern India or the wheat plains in China might have been subject to the state impacting them and leading to more collectivism or whatnot because they force people to live closer together, or the arrangement makes people dependent on large collective action in order to manage some aspect of their environment, like setting up large dikes to control the water or the flood season or whatever in China. And that is sort of absent in Europe. You have relatively reasonable and consistent rains. So you might end up with less, say, need for collectivism there as a result of that different environment. And it leads to a long path of differences. Like if you end up more collectivist or individualist early on, this could affect your cultural institutions in a way that leads to some sort of self-propagating effect later on. All sorts of stuff like that is totally feasible.
And
Mhm.
migration is also slightly related to intelligence in the sense that groups that are forced to migrate must navigate new circumstances. As a result, they're encouraged to become more innovative because on a daily basis, to survive, they would need to solve novel problems.
Yeah, that could be definitely be true. There is some work by Gallord and Ojak showing that in the year 1500, or sorry, immigration in the year 1500, I believe, or no, sorry, I got this wrong.
Ode
G-
Gaylor?
yeah, 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 him. From 2009, it's called Isolation and Development.
Yeah, I'm
They
familiar with the
found that
study.
you
But go
are
ahead.
okay. So, for the audience, pre-modern trade isolation harmed economic, or they wanted to examine the validity of the idea that pre-modern trade isolation harmed economic development of the year 2000 through these sort of long-term economic effects of different things like Roman roads or whatever. But they found quite the opposite. There was a sort of positive relationship between trade isolation in the year 1500 and economic development in the year 2000. I don't really know too much about the validity of that study in terms of their measures or whatever it may be, but that's always a possibility.
Yeah, I like Ode Gaylor. I think he's a fascinating researcher. But the point that he's making is that in the past, collectivism was more important to economic growth. But with
Right.
development, we're forced to innovate and become more individualistic. So earlier
Hmm.
societies had an incentive to be protectionist.
Yep.
I think that's the point he was trying to make.
Mhm.
But so far so good. Now we're going to get to your paper, Global Ancestry and Cognitive Ability. You may expound. Tell us a little
So
about it.
in global ancestry and cognitive ability, what we looked at was the relationship between admixture, meaning the proportion of ancestry you have from one or another group, defined whichever way. For us, it was defined continentally, which is the typical way races or races slash ethnicities, to be a little more concise, are defined. What we did was we looked at the relationship between that and intelligence, because there is a predicted relationship if there is some genetic impact on that difference between groups. The expected effect of admixture when you have an admixed population is, can be mathematically stated. I don't know if you want the mathematical stipulation, but I can provide it to you if you really need.
You may do
And
so.
sure. So for us, the formula we were looking for was One moment. The group difference divided by the mean of in terms of ancestry, like their proportion of ancestry from one or the other group, provided this is a population that is basically mixed between two groups and not a third component that might be added in there, a fourth component, or whatever it may be, minus the proportion of admixture from, again, the same sort of group in the second population you're looking at, which is itself divided by the standard deviation in the second group of admixture. So for us, it was we had a difference, I believe, in this study of 1.01, like standardized difference, like Hedges G, and the European Americans, the white Americans, whatever you wish to call that group, were in our study 98.6% European. The African Americans, they were 18.7% European on average, and they had a standard deviation for this their ancestry, the European ancestry, of 11.7%. So the expected correlation for us between the degree of admixture, like from Europe or from Africa, if you want to do it in reverse, whichever way you want to do it, you can, was 0.148. Like it's a small correlation if the difference between the groups themselves was fully due to differences in their like the frequencies of different genes in these populations. We never expected there to be a full relationship of any sort, but we've expected some sort of partial relationship. In prior studies, this has been studied before. It was studied before in a lot of earlier works. These earlier works were all small and they were imprecise. The earliest I'm aware of that actually looked at this was, and do you mind if I'm going into studies like this? I don't know if
I
it's
don't
too
mind
on
at
topic.
all.
Right. So the first study that I am aware of, and there might be one earlier, but I would have to ask or look or be told about it, was by Whitty and Jenkins in 1936. They wanted to look at the relationship between admixture and ability because it's an obvious conclusion that if there is a difference between groups, there should be a continuous difference. There should be a relationship between the degree to which people derive from different groups and the trait in question. So for them, what they did was they took a sample of, I believe it was like 103 or 104 very bright African American students who were in the far tail of the ability distribution, the right tail, smart people. I think they had scored as above 125 IQ points or 130, I believe, something like that. And they assessed the extent to which admixture in this population was related to their intelligence, because the expectation in an admixed population is that your more intelligent people derive more from the more intelligent group if there is some genetic causality there. And genetic causality can be interpreted however people really wish, so long as it's interpreted charitably. So what they did was they categorized people into different groups. There was one that was considered to be nearly 100% derived from Africa, like African admixture, one that was about 50%, one that was about 66% or so, and one that was about 33%. And they found that the average wasn't really related to the degree of the trait. It explained very, very little of the difference. But this was a bit of a miscalculation. So they compared the level of admixture in their study to are between what are called gifted, which is the IQ over 140, and superior, which is just the name of the IQ range. Like in the past, different IQ scores have been a lot given to different ranges, like average, above average, superior, gifted, etc. They compared the levels of admixture in these different groups, expecting there to be a higher level in the higher group, provided there is some genetic contribution to the gap. And they couldn't find much. The gifted sample was, I think, 1.2 or 1.5% more European, which was simply not enough to explain the difference. It wouldn't have made any sense. The problem is that they were relying on sort of self-reports of ancestry and classifying people into these rather not so granular groups that were imprecise and too imprecise, certainly, for studying the relationship, which is a small relationship across whole groups between admixture and ability. And so they ended up with a null result, but they also had no power to detect anything. The next study that I'm aware of was by Lowland, Vandenberg, and Osborne. This was in 1973. They combined data from a twin study in Kentucky and a twin study in Georgia. They had a combined sample size of 84 twins, I believe, and they found that blood groups were not like that indicated ancestry, did not produce any evidence for a relationship between admixture and ability. They did, however, find that their 18 blood loci that they were working with um, could not have possibly delivered any information on this relationship because they didn't discriminate enough. They didn't have modern measures like we do of admixture, which are based on like genes themselves. So they again found a null result, but they also had no power. Then the last and most major study I'm aware of, and there is another one that was conducted on, I believe, Chileans, but I'm not aware of the name at the moment, was by Scarr, Slopotek, Paxtis, Katz, and Barker in 1977. This was supposed to be a methodologically improved version of the earlier Lowland, Vandenberg, and Osborne study from 1973. What they did was they looked at blood groups in a Philadelphia sample of some nearly 200 African American twins, and they wanted to see the relationship between dizygotic twins, meaning non-identical fraternal twins. They wanted to see the relationship between, again, blood groups indicating ancestry and ability, and they again found not much. The results were consistent with a relationship, but they simply had no power for it to be significant. So we wanted to compare our results using modern genomic methods in large samples to these earlier studies to see if their low power could be contravened, say. And it did seem to be the case. Those low-powered studies were not replicated. We didn't get a null result. We got a positive result. We got a rather dispositive result that there was a relationship between measured admixture and ability, and it was consistent with explaining around half, just slightly over half of the difference between the groups. There is some measurement error in there. There is some sampling error in there. And there are some moderate discontinuities in ancestry at certain areas of the distribution because there aren't very many people to be sampled that are like 40% European or 50% European or 60% European. There's somewhat of a discontinuity. There are some people in that range, but they're a little more rare. And there is range restriction where people cannot be more than 100% European or less than 0% European. So there is some attenuation, perhaps, of our effect, but we're not really sure of how to adjust for that. But anyway, what we found was some evidence consistent with what Scarr in 1977 would have called some evidence for a relationship between admixture and ability, which means that different continental, what you would call continental ancestry groups or racial groups, racial ethnicity groups, their
Okay.
genes did seem to have an effect on their ability. Sorry, go ahead. At least not at the group level.
No, we just wanted to tell you to speak louder, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I too quiet?
Yes, sir.
Was any part of that unable to be heard?
No, I heard everything, but just please project clearly.
Sure thing. Will do.
Yes. All right. So are you finished discussing the studies?
Yeah, for the most part.
All right.
I will add that we did test invariance by the measurement invariance by the level of ancestry to assess a particular hypothesis. We wanted to see if the relationship between admixture and ability could be confounded by different influences along the way. So what we thought about there was that, for example, the relationship between admixture and ability could be spurious. It could be due to people who have more or less European admixture or more or less African admixture being, say, darker and experiencing more discrimination in their lives. This influence would need to be something that was experienced across the whole range and based on the same sort of influences for there to be measurement invariance. It's a rather strong property of the finding when you get measurement invariance that the influences on the thing you're measuring have to be the same by group, at least in terms of qualitative content, if not the level of the antecedents of the scores. So we looked across the range of admixture to see if there was evidence for invariance in terms of like going from 0 to 100% European or African or whatever. And we found that there was evidence for invariance. So whatever influences lead to differences across the range from 0 to 100% European or African, they seem to be common influences, not things that can be assigned to one or another group alone.
All right. So Jordan?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Jordan, so far you have been doing well, but you must explain to our listeners why European genes are overtaking African American genes or Native American genes. F- i- let me be a bit more precise. Why are descendants of Europeans more likely to be intelligent? So if you're a mixed person, why don't you reflect the intelligence of your black parent? Why the white parent?
So intelligence is a polygenic trait. It's a trait influenced by very many genes. And these very many genes have additive effects. They work together in tandem to produce the trait alongside whatever environmental influences might impact it during development or at whatever contextualized moment you are in. Now, the reason that they have this continuous influence is because the genes that are more frequent in certain populations are more or less likely than another population to be related to, or positively at least, to some trait of interest, in a sense. So the reason that you would have higher levels of cognitive ability with more European ancestry would be because you have a higher level of cognitive ability for genetic reasons in the European group, or you have some environmental confounding on that ancestry estimate that leads to that effect. So historically, you have had admixture in African Americans. I'm hoping this is well known, but let me explain briefly. Um, when African Americans were brought here as slaves, for the most part, they interbred with the European population, and this has led them to, in the modern day, have 15 to 25%, probably more on the lower end, European admixture. And there's considerable degree of difference within the population. There's a large standard deviation for the degree of admixture. Individuals who are, quote, mixed race, meaning they have one socially identifying like black or white parent each, they tend to score roughly in the middle of their two parents and in the middle of their two parent populations. This is a rather robust finding. There's been about a century of work on it, looking at, because it's a way of addressing this exact hypothesis of seeing if there is a difference between the populations, and if this difference between the populations is reflected by a prediction from when there are differences in admixture in expected degrees. So when we have a parent from one population or another, we assume that they reflect the degree of admixture in their respective populations, and that this will lead to about a midway result between the population means for their children. It's almost never precisely true because there are reasons for interbreeding between populations or their influence on it. Like individuals who are more educated in the African American population are more likely to have white spouses, for example, and this might lead to some attenuation of the estimate or some change in the estimate from what is purely expected based on the group means. But for the most part, it seems to work out to at least um, some part of the expected relationship between admixture and ability when you look at individuals who are, quote, mixed race.
Jordan, I'm happy that you introduced our show to that point because I am enthralled by the topic. Educated black men, especially, are likely to marry outside of their race. And in my spare time, I have deduced several reasons to explain this development. And one thesis is that maybe they're likely to date or marry white women because of personality. Could that be a possible factor? So, for
It could
example,
be.
for
Sorry,
example,
go ahead.
blacks are higher in delusions. They're less likely to trust the political system and the health system, and intelligent people are more likely to be pro-social. On the show,
Mhm.
I have said that pro-sociality in intelligent people is a consequence of manipulation. They want to manipulate people into their pro-social. But I could be right, or I may just be cynical. However, we do know that intelligent people are able to temper a situation when it becomes too hostile. So maybe based on the personality difference between educated blacks and ordinary black people, educated blacks are likely to date white people because they're closer in relation to personality. They're pro-social, they could be less impulsive, etc., etc. And there are well documented differences in intelligence, individualism, and time preference.
Right. That could be the case. I can't really speak to it, but I can speak to an expectation. So, my expectation for more educated African Americans is that they're going to end up in an environment that has relatively more European individuals, relatively more Asian individuals. And this is going to lead them to a sort of social homogamy where they're more likely, the ceteris paribus, assuming you're just likely to date those who are around you, to date individuals who are of a different race because they're going to be surrounded by a relatively large proportion of people who are of a different race in their social milieu, in their jobs, their daily lives, their social groups of all variety. And I think that will probably explain the majority of it. There could be a lot more belief homogeneity within those groups. They could be different from the broader African American population, but I can't really speak to it at the moment. It is an interesting theory, though.
Yes, and during your research, you often make reference to skin, hair, and eye color. Is there a specific relationship between skin color and intelligence?
So what we found there is that skin color does seem to have a relationship, but it is not a what I would call a specific relationship. And by that I mean a relationship independent of what it proxies for. So differences in skin color, in ear formation, in nose formation, whatever you want to call it, like all these different markers that have historically been used to proxy ancestry are just that. They are proxies for ancestry. And to the extent that they proxy ancestry, which we believe to be the true cause of the relationship, you are likely to get some relationship between those things and ability. I don't think they have an independent influence. The reason I say that is because, for example, we have family studies where people have looked at the relationship between dark skin tone or or lighter skin tone or population like features. For example, individuals have been described in some surveys, like in Rowe, a very nice, great social researcher who died not too long ago, did a lot of work with the National Longitudinal Study of Youth. And there was a part where individuals in it were described as African appearing when they were mixed race. And he used this to make the point that even though they appear or are socially identified by raters as African American, these people who are mixed race tend to score still in the middle of their parents. The expectation with this eye, skin, and hair color stuff is that if discrimination on the basis of one's phenotype, how they look, how they appear, and everything, is the reason for the relationship, that it will have a special relationship, that it will be the thing driving the relationship between admixture and ability, and it'll have a relatively stronger relationship if that is the case. Additionally, within families, you will find that the individual, like the twin, the sibling, the whatever, who looks more or less like the group that you are proposing to be discriminated against, um, they will tend to have lower ability. But this is actually not really corroborated. It doesn't seem to be corroborated. The reason for this, that it's a good test, is because alleles independently assort within families. So there should be no relationship between admixture and ability or sorry, not admixture and ability, but between the genes for these things within families. They should be disassociated. So appearance and ability or whatnot should not be associated with the families. They should be between them due to patterns of assortative mating that maintain linkage disequilibrium, which I'm
Or
glad you brought that term up earlier now.
yes, yes, I don't like to confuse people. And again, Jordan, brain size and intelligence. What is the link? Some studies argue that there is a correlation, but mainstream researchers often ignore the issue. I've never read a mainstream journal making a link between brain size and intelligence.
That's curious. I have
Or should
a
I say,
study
I've
by
never read a mainstream person, in the sense that the people who usually discuss the issue, we know that they're controversial.
perhaps. I believe that, for example, Pechnig, Penke, Vickers, Zahler, and Voracek in 2015, they're rather mainstream people, and they published in a rather mainstream journal. What they looked at was they meta-analyzed the relationship between human brain volumes and intelligence, and they found a slight relationship around 0.24 between whole brain volume and intelligence, in that generalizes across different age groups. So it was pretty similar in children and adults. And that was published in Neuroscience Biobehavior and Biobehavioral Reviews. which I think is rather mainstream.
Yeah, that's a
The
mainstream
relation,
journal. But a study like that will not be featured by the New York Times.
right? It will not be. Yes, it's too contentious a topic. That study was followed up by an interesting review of it, where they looked at the moderating quality for the relationship of the moderating effect of the quality of the IQ test used by Gignac and Bates, Gilles Gignac and Tim Bates in Intelligence in 2017. They reanalyzed the meta-analysis, found that the relationship was probably around zero point 0.4, a correlation of zero point 0.4 between brain size and intelligence. Um, the relationship is not likely to get harped on by anybody because it's, again, very contentious, although it is extremely well evidenced. It's a
Exactly. There are
relation.
several studies making this point. That's why I'm
Yeah.
surprised that mainstream journalists don't talk about it more frequently. And if they do, the impression is given that the writer is a fringe scientist.
Yeah. It's humorous when the majority of the evidence points in just this one direction, both between and within families. And you find, yes, larger brains lead to greater intelligence. The reason seems to be something to do with neuron count for the most part. So, this is also why you don't get a difference in intelligence between men and women due to this, because men have very much larger brains, but they do not have brains that are as dense. The neuron count between men and women is not especially different. It is different, but it is not terribly different. Women have more dense brains. They're not less intelligent when we actually go and measure intelligence. Um, there are differences between groups in the size of brains, and these differences go away when you, and Jensen looked at this in the 1990s, in the, I think it was the collaborative perinatal project cohort. He found that once you controlled for brain size, there remain differences between groups because it is an imperfect proxy for intelligence. But once you controlled for intelligence, there were no differences in brain size between groups. It's an interesting little reversal there.
Yeah, why? Why is this
So,
so?
it's due to there being multiple causes for intelligence, whereas brain size is more, I'm not going to say it's more singularly caused. That's not correct. Uh, there's a phenomenon called many to oneness or supervenience, which is contrasted with a phenomenon called isomorphism, which is one to oneness. So the relationship between different factors affecting brain size, like white matter tract integrity or the presence of lesions on the brain, these are all things that partially contribute or could partially contribute. There's really not much great causal evidence yet to intelligence, but they do not cause it on their own. So they're not going to produce these one-to-one relationships that would give rise to isomorphism. They're going to be supervenient. So they're going to be affected by many things. And this is going to lead to this sort of expectation where um, the thing being affected, like intelligence, can be used to get rid of that difference. But the reverse is not true since there are simply too many influences on intelligence besides that.
All
I
right.
hope that makes
So
sense.
yeah, I'm listening carefully. On this show, I like to listen and I may speak, but viewers prefer a host who does not speak extensively.
Hmm.
So I only speak when necessary if I have something really interesting to say. So I'm going to speak
Gotcha.
now, but it isn't in the form of a question. Researchers have also observed racial differences in brain size.
Hmm.
So you are a researcher, you are an expert, and I wouldn't say that I'm controversial because controversy means new or different, and I'm not making a point that's different. I think my ideas sometimes are quite boring because much of what I'm saying it's not new. People have said it years before. But go ahead.
So you want me to talk about specifically brain size differences between groups?
Yes, yes. So
Um,
do Asians have bigger brains? Do blacks have smaller brains in relation to whites? And is this
yes.
impacted by the environment? Again, we can go back to the cold winter theory.
Yes, they are. Well, I'm saying there are differences between groups. There's a black-white gap in brain size of around, I think it's zero point 0.6 standard deviations. So if you multiply that by um, the relationship between intelligence and brain size, which is, let's say, zero point 0.4, and then you multiply it by the standard deviation of intelligence, which is common between groups, you get something like let me just do the math here real quick. 0.6 times 0.4 times 15 would be 3.6 IQ points out of the 15-point difference. 3.6 over 15 is going to be 24%. So that explains 24% of the difference between the groups, the difference in brain size, which is a proxy for things like differences in neuron counts or whatever it may be. This is not a huge part of the gap between the groups. It's just a part. There are differences. They could appear for whatever reason, and they could be partially explanatory.
Yes.
When Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if the IQ gap could be a function of brain size.
Partly. I believe it is probably partly. That seems reasonable to me. So the reason it's reasonable, I would say, is because it does proxy for differences in neuron count. We do know that those are related to inter-individual differences between people. People who have larger brains, as I just explicated earlier, are more intelligent. So it seems reasonable that some degree of this group gap is due to things that differ between individuals within the groups. Now, it's not, again, it's only 24% with that estimate from Gignac and Bates, the 0.4 relationship, and a zero point 0.6 standard deviation difference in brain sizes, and a standard deviation in the IQ test of 15. So not a huge part, but some part. Definitely, definitely. There are probably many things that are more influential, but they're more granular things. That not more granular, but they're smaller things that you might not think about as much, like differences in white matter tract integrity. Those seem to be particularly important for inter-individual differences in intelligence. The reason you can relate the inter-individual and the group differences is because the latter is simply a product of the former. When you have measurement and variance, when you can actually compare the constructs being measured and thus the influences on those constructs in terms of the same sorts of degree of influence when you have the same sort of level of stuff. So, for instance, brain size and intelligence should be similarly related in terms of their causal impact in both groups that you're comparing. I hope that
Yes.
makes sense.
Quite obvious research, nothing outlandish.
Right.
No, no, Jordan. I was just being sarcastic.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, of course, to some people it is outlandish, but not to sensible people. So, so Jordan, you publish a paper that it is somewhat interesting. I read it. The conclusions were obvious because of my own research, but some are upset that you did a study titled The Intelligence of Biracial Children of US Servicemen in Northeast Asia Results from Japan. So talk about it briefly and then I'm going to tell you why people are upset.
Oh, I think I can guess. So what that study was it was actually a replication of a much more famous study called the Eiferth study, named for its author Klaus Eiferth, who looked at the IQs of white and quote racially mixed individuals in post World War II West Germany. So he was looking at individuals who were the sons and daughters of soldiers, U.S. soldiers stationed in Germany. And he found that regardless of their parent, they seem to have really similar IQs, which is not the expectation when you think about the population averages. When you think about the population averages, you say you have one with an average IQ of 85 or one with an average IQ of 100. You expect the kids to have an IQ somewhere in the middle. Now, there's a little bit of qualification required for this study because the groups are somewhat of the parents are somewhat selected and we are missing a lot of information and it's quite small. But we thought, interesting, if it is true, it's been used as an argument against a hereditary interpretation of the relationship between admixture and ability when you're looking at mixed race kids, the thing I talked about earlier. The idea there is that in a different cultural context, in this case, West Germany, the relationship is nullified because they're, for whatever reason, could be no more relationship because it was a social thing to begin with. So the idea there is that in West Germany, there might be, say, less discrimination against individuals who are mixed race and thus no middling IQs between their racial groups. We replicated this in Japan with another relatively small sample with some all right measures. They weren't great measures, but they were all right, and found that individuals who were part Japanese and part European or part African American, in this case, which African American, by the way, referred to as an ethnic group rather than a racial group because they are not just, from this one continent. They do derive that 15 to 25% from Europe is different than people who are just African. We found that there was still no difference. So it replicated the IFIRTH results, found that perhaps in a different cultural context, there's no relationship between admixture and ability. But again, our study is a little dubious. Like a lot of the children were the product of, and I hate to say this, they were the product of rape. They were kids who were given up for adoption. They were kids who were raised in quite terrible scenarios, and we don't have any information on the parents with which to calibrate our expectations. It's the same. It's similar to the case in the IFIR study where there was no way to calibrate the expectation for what the children's IQ should be because we don't have the information on the parents. Anyway, that is the study.
Yes, but some take umbrage with the fact that in the piece it is enumerated that the woman could contribute to lower IQs, and to an extent, I agree. Prostitutes are usually not intelligent women, and they score higher on measures of psychopathy.
That's correct.
So, taking these factors into account, the children of prostitute should not be impressive in terms of IQ.
That's probably correct.
Yes, but
Yeah.
some were quite angry that you made reference to the low quality of the mothers. But
Yes, and you could chalk this up to anything really. I mean, there could be a more Flynn, James Flynn, a Flynnian take on this that say the mother is less likely to be educated, and she could give her children less opportunity to be educated themselves, unless they might score worse on intelligence tests or whatnot. I'm not actually amenable to that explanation. I don't believe it's plausible because intelligence doesn't seem to be influenced very much, like in terms of the actual construct itself, by education. But you could definitely make that argument and make the case a little less, mm, a little more amenable, I should say, to people who don't like that statement, even though it seems to be robust and quite clearly true.
but let's revert to the earlier study that was done that was done on Germans.
Hmm.
I think in order to arrive at a conclusive thesis, we need to do a longitudinal study covering several generations.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
these studies are too small to make a real impact. So, for example, Germany originally is the intellectual mecca of Europe. Germany has disproportionately produced scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, innovators, and philosophers. They
Yes,
have,
I believe a lot of that is due to their history of decentralization. They were relatively more decentralized than the rest of Europe, which led to, competition among states being more of a thing, even though they were involved in a union with one another. It led to more focus on localized development by local lords in the Kleinstadter. But
yeah,
anyway, keep going.
yes. So and the PhD was virtually invented in Germany. The Germans were the first people to style themselves as doctors, unlike the
Mhm.
English who were more invested in the master's degree. So maybe the culture of Germany could be motivating cognitive ability.
Now, I have my reasons for doubting these things. A lot of people talk about cross national differences and they talk about them rather loosely and they talk about them without much good evidence. So I did a presentation. I gave it the International Society for Intelligence Research in 2019, a poster where I talked about international differences. I wanted to look at the degree to which something called Spearman's hypothesis was true. Spearman's hypothesis is that group differences, and in particular, differences between blacks, whites, and other groups for which there are large score gaps, are due to differences in general intelligence. And I wanted to look at this across the globe. Now, it's a contentious thing. Most studies done across nations, comparing nations, do not find that the test can actually be compared. So I looked for whatever samples I could that could be compared. This study, I think I called it Spearman's hypothesis across nations or something of that nature. And I looked at many different countries in Africa, in South America, across Asia. I looked at norming samples for tests. I gathered up hundreds and hundreds of different samples, mostly summary statistics to work with to compare them to the group of white Americans across different tests. And I found that when you could compare to them, the results were like, in terms, there was measurement of variance. The tests were unbiased. The comparison between countries could definitely be made in these samples. And there wasn't too much argument for the samples in some countries being more or less selected relative to their national populations than others. It did seem that the results were very much in line with prior results on national differences in intelligence. Now, what that implies is that there are likely no unique cultural effects on intelligence. When you have measurement invariance, what you are saying, and by measurement invariance, I mean that when you have a factor model being a model of a construct in psychology like intelligence, or like the big five personality traits like conscientiousness, neuroticism, even depression, or whatever it is that your questionnaire you're giving or your test you're giving is designed to measure or is supposed to measure, whatever you're measuring, when that model, which relates the tests to what they have in common, which is the taken to be the construct, is constructed in different groups, it has the same parameters. So the same relationships between the constructs and the tests, the items on the test, the same intercepts. So when they hit that y-axis there, they are hitting it at the same level in different groups for that regression slope, and the same residuals in terms of the residual variances and the residual means and all that. When those residuals of the items left over after you've constructed your factor model are equal between groups, it means that the residual influences on those items are likewise of the same sort. If you have different influences in different groups, your variances of your items will differ considerably, and this will lead to them being incomparable to some degree, at least in terms of the variances. I found that across many countries, you could compare things even in terms of their variances, which means that the influences have to be of like kind. They have to be, say, if there's a cultural influence in Germany that is unique to Germany, it also has to be found in the US and Uruguay and China and Japan and every other country for which we could actually have a legitimate comparison. This rules out a lot of cultural explanations. It kind of kicks them to the curb, because if those influences are unique and not just a quantitative difference between countries, then they could not have influenced the result, or it would have been too underpowered to detect the influence of those things. And I don't believe that to be the case. My
All
samples
right.
were usually large.
So tell us about the replicability of IQ tests outside of the States. In other countries, is the black-white IQ gap also persistent?
So when you talk about the black white IQ gap outside of the United States, what you typically talk about is the difference between countries, which people talk about as being black countries or white countries or whatever. So Europe or sub-Saharan Africa. We don't really talk about the within country difference within other countries, except for those like the UK, because there's just a paucity of data. There aren't large sub-Saharan African populations or admixed sub-Saharan African populations whose what you'd call ethnic origin in some continent or other is clearly identifiable. Across Latin America, for instance, individuals are simply incredibly mixed. So it's hard to really test the same sort of theories in those countries without genetic information, because you don't know what a self-identification means in those states. It's not as consistent as it is in the United States, where admixture is primarily between two groups. So sub-Saharan Africans and Europeans, versus in Latin America, like in Brazil, you might find that there's admixture from Asia and Africa and Latin America itself and Europe alongside each other, and people are identifying as one or another group, which means a totally different thing than it does in the United States, which is to say there's no invariance of the identifications with respect to the level of admixture across countries. In the United Kingdom, there is a little bit of study on this topic.
Yes,
There's
I've
not
heard some.
much there's not much data is the thing. That's the major problem, is that we rely on proxies when we want to talk about the differences between, say, blacks and whites or Asians and whites or whoever else in the United Kingdom. And we talk about proxies like the GCSEs, and we compare scores where there's a teacher rating component for the student, or there's something else that might plausibly allow people to say, I don't really think this is an unbiased comparison, like an intelligence test can be shown to be in the United States. So there is some evidence for, say, minor gaps, like in the United Kingdom, between, for example, individuals who say they are descended from the Igbo ethnic group and people who are identified as British white or Irish or just white in general in these areas. And this could be due to selection or whatever. I'm really not sure. I don't think there's enough good data in those areas yet to really
Okay.
say much. And that's generally the case across countries. There's not much good data. The UK is where there's like the best non-US data, and it's still not great.
All right. So therefore, America is then the best standard.
Yes, it is. And I believe um it's a good standard as and the results are probably generalizable because we know that we can compare African American populations to say European populations without bias.
All
So it's
right.
likely that the things would generalize.
Now, Jordan, you also contributed to a paper titled "Racial and Ethnic Group Differences in the Heritability of Intelligence." Give a brief synopsis.
So this study looked at a variety of twin studies of the heritability of intelligence in the mostly United States that in order to compare different racial groups to see is there a difference as expected under a theory called the Scarr-Rowe hypothesis um, between these different racial groups. So Scarr in 1971 and Jensen prior in 1968 hypothesized that groups who were relatively environmentally deprived, meaning they grew up poor, they grew up without educational opportunity, they grew up, et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. In environments that were just not conducive to the development of intelligence, would be have show less heritability because environments would be relatively more important for these people. So in Scar's paper, which is entitled "Race, Social Class, and IQ" from 1971, that's the paper that is the basis for the name of the hypothesis. She replicated her work in 1980 or 1981, a small replication, not much to it, and found similar results. It seemed that there was something in the direction of African Americans having lower heritability for intelligence because, again, it is they grow up in more impoverished environments relative to the U.S.'s white population. And this impoverishment is in terms of, again, things like their ability to access a high quality education, their ability to, say, get a tutor, their ability to get proper nutrition, whatever it may be. So she corroborated this again. Small corroboration, not terribly strong. Then Rowe did a similar thing in 1999, where he looked at the relationship between measured verbal intelligence, which is probably mostly just a measure of intelligence, and the education of one's parents. And he found that there were heritability differences along that. So people who had more educated parents had showed higher heritabilities for intelligence. And for us, we wanted to extrapolate the same way that Scarr did in her initial 1971 study, which is the exact same way that Jensen talked about it in 1968, albeit he didn't do it with empirical evidence like she did with her Philadelphia cohort. So we looked at a variety of different cohorts. We found that there did not seem to be much difference between these groups. And there was certainly not a significant difference. And though we didn't publish it with it, there was some modest power to detect a difference of about 5, 6, 7, 8%, like that around that range between these groups, and we just couldn't find it. In fact, the differences seem to be so minor in each of the studies that it didn't seem like the relative environmental depression was leading to much difference as expected.
All right. So Jordan, more well, I read your study, all of it, and I looked at the references. However, I did not recognize the base reference at the time, but I read the base study, and you are corroborating his conclusion.
Yes, well,
Yes,
we are attempting to assess the Scarr hypothesis as Scarr would have put it. Because Scar's initial reason she proposed this hypothesis of higher heritability in environments where, like, basically what you're saying is there's an asymptote for the relationship between environments and intelligence, where improving your environment doesn't make you continuously more intelligent unless the environmental antecedents you're improving are directly causal factors in intelligence, like, say, some sort of drug that gives you a chemical identified to have an effect on intelligence during development. And
uh,
unless it's something like that, you're likely to get an asymptotic relationship between environmental quality and the IQ of the child.
get a what type of relationship?
Asymptotic. So as you improve environmental quality, the gains you get from improving environmental quality to the IQ of the child are going to diminish. You're going to get diminishing returns. You can't just keep making their environment better and making them smarter, as it were.
All right, but we're going to wrap up soon, therefore we will not discuss this paper in all its essence, but
Mhm.
some researchers responded to your piece. Eric Turkheimer and Evan Gian Grande.
Yeah, I think
Don't,
Gian Grande was the primary author.
yes,
I don't want to say that Eric was too involved in it. He might have been, for all I know. But
okay.
their response is not very scientifically sound.
No, no, and look at the title: Race, Ethnicity, and the Scarr-Rowe Hypothesis. A cautionary example of fringe science entering the mainstream. There is nothing unusual about what you're researching. Intelligence is highly heritable, and many studies have discredited the impact of the environment. So there's nothing outrageous about your conclusions.
I would
And
say, in a
look
sense,
at
that's true.
and
Yeah.
before you continue, let me make another quick point. A
Mhm.
cautionary example of fringe science entering the mainstream. Science is amoral. Do not compose a response to fashion a political point.
I
So
agree with you
the
there.
title
I
suggests that we can't take it seriously because
Mhm.
the heritability of intelligence is well known.
Right.
So expressing the hereditarian position is not unscientific.
I wouldn't even say it's expressing the hereditarian position as such. It's just expressing that there is this hypothesis, elaborated at first by Scarr in 1971, that environmental deprivation should reduce the heritability of intelligence. And we find that these different groups do have different environmental qualities as measured by the typical proxy, socioeconomic status. And this should lead to differences in the expected direction, provided we have sufficient power to detect those differences. Um, the difference between African Americans and European American or white Americans, whatever you wish to call them, in the United States in terms of socioeconomic status is around Russell Warren calculated this to be around 0.6 standard deviations, or to 0.6 in terms of like Cohen's d. So the expected difference due to the Scarr-Rowe effect is like 10% at most. It's not very high. So we had relatively low power for detecting differences between a lot of different racial groups because they weren't simply represented enough, but we did have sufficient power to detect a difference between African Americans and white Americans
All
in
right.
terms of heritability.
So, but before I go, let me make some more quick points.
Sure.
One, in your paper, you also submit that heritability was actually higher in some minority groups.
Yeah, don't take that too seriously. That's an interpretation of the direction rather than the significance of the thing.
Yeah. And you
So that
mentioned
was
A
very
value. What is an A value?
Oh, that's the so in a typical model of heritability and environmentality of something where you're measuring the heritability of something, you might have what's called an ACE model. The ACE model is A, additive genetic effects, C, shared environmental effects, and E, unshared environmental effects. Shared environmental effects are simply those things besides the additive influence of genes, which makes siblings more similar. Additive genetic effects are simply those uh, the degree to which genes have an additive influence on a trait. And E, the unshared environment, is basically a residual. So it's whatever is left over after those things are parcel out for the most part.
Okay, all right. So, and
And the
again, final point. This is my theory. You can either refute it or dismiss it. Dismiss it. Some argue that there is a relationship between poverty and genes. The notion is that maybe harsh environments are mutating genes. So after looking at the data, I surmise that maybe because of their environment, African Americans are African Americans and other groups, not just Black people, but people living in harsher environments, could be experiencing mutations. And the mutations are rapid, so it appears that they're less likely to inherit IQ when the issue is that due to the mutations, the IQ is depressed.
So what you're hitting at is that mutations have a generally deleterious effect on traits that are considered desirable, like height. They increase autism risk. They lead to like lower intelligence, smaller brains, et cetera, et cetera. I don't believe there's a major environmental effect on the like a mutagenic effect by population group. A lot of environmental influences that might give rise to that effect, like an air pollution or lead, whatever, that could be different between the groups, probably aren't differentiated enough for there to be a major influence on the rate of mutation accumulation.
Okay.
The number of mutations per generation is quite small in general, so I don't expect this to be making a differential contribution across in the United States
All right.
or most of the
But
countries.
you're yet to do a study, so we never know.
We never
And
know.
I am outside. I am not a scientist. I am outside of the field, and historically, people adjacent to certain professions have been the innovators. So you never know.
You never know. It
And
could be something we test one day.
yes, and again, maybe you should also study the impact of disease on the heritability of intelligence. Look
Oh,
at this.
definitely.
Look at the Scarr-Rowe hypothesis more broadly.
Absolutely. I agree. It should be looked at a lot more broadly, and it should be looked at in a lot with a lot more influences used to proxy for environmental quality.
But I
Absolutely.
enjoyed our conversation, Jordan. You're an impressive guest, and at some point again we will speak. All right.
All righty. You have a good one.
All right. Bye.